Welcome to Military Images Live. Getting set up here. Give everybody an opportunity to come on. There's our makeup. Where's my makeup professional? Makeup. Hello, Fred. I've got my makeup in I hope everybody's doing well. We'll give you a couple moments to come on. Where's my makeup person? When you have the kind of hairstyle that I do, having makeup is helpful. All right, we'll give everybody just a moment here to come online. Thank you very much for coming out. Tonight, Andrew, thank you for the laughter. And hi. Fred, welcome. Chris, how you doing? Mike, how's everybody doing? See, Kurt Luther is with us. Kyle, hello from Virginia. Hello from Virginia. Gene, be careful with the weather down there in South Carolina. Rick Wolf, how are you doing, sir? Hello, Kurt Luther. All right, we'll give everybody another minute to come on, and then we'll get started. While we're waiting, I'll turn the screen a little bit here. And all of you who are tuning in tonight are getting about the first look at the cover of the autumn issue of Military Images magazine. I have to say, when I met with Kevin Camberg, the collector whose images are featured in this issue, I really had no idea which image was going to be chosen or selected for the cover. He has such a fine collection, be hard pressed to pick one to be on the cover. But this one surprised me. I have to say, it wasn't exactly on my short list. Kevin and I had talked about several possibilities for the cover, and I looked at them, but then when I played this one out, I was really captivated. When the image is larger, you really get a sense of the presence that this particular soldier he has. Of the soldier picture here, he's sitting on a log in a studio with a bit of a backdrop. He's very plain dressed. He has a 4-button sack coat on and a civilian hat. He's holding a canteen. There's actually not a whole lot about him that speaks to a military bearing. However, that's also very common for late war Union soldiers. This man he has customized his uniform. He's clearly a veteran. He's dressed lean. He's dressed mean. And I think he's giving us something of a hint about him. Holding that canteen and sitting on the log tells us that he's been out. He's been on campaign. We don't know his identity. We don't know who he is. But this image really is I think it's a powerful and representative image of the late war Union soldier. Really quite terrific. And for those of you who subscribe to the magazine, I can't wait for you to see it in person when it comes to your mailbox sometime in the next couple of weeks. Or if you get our digital edition, you can also see it online that way. So this is a fantastic image, and I want to give a special thanks to Kevin Camberg for all of the work that he did. I should talk a minute too about when we produce a gallery of a collector's images, it's not a simple matter of going over and scanning a bunch of photos. It's really the beginning of a pretty serious collaborative effort that begins with taking a look at all the images, making selections for a short list, which usually numbers about 40, maybe 50 images. And then from there, we go through the painful editing process to determine which of the images are really the best images to be considered representative images of that individual's collecting. And it depends upon the person. It can take a while to get there. But once we do, that's just sort of another beginning point, because we've got captions to write. We have an interview to do with the collector to get a sense of their background. Then there's writing, there's pre-production, there's editing, all that good stuff. And then, of course, the final design of the gallery, both for print and online. So it's a fairly lengthy process, not always for the faint of heart, but I can tell you, with all the collectors who have participated, it's really given me a great sense of the community of collectors and the passion with which they collect and the enthusiasm that they have, not only for their collection, but for Civil War photography. So Kevin is certainly a role model in the group of collectors, and I salute him tonight with his cover. So that's the first order of business. I want to take you to the next image. This comes from the Chris Ford collection. Her name is Rebecca Pomeroy. If you know of nursing in the Civil War, on the Union side, you'll know about Rebecca. She's really best known for being the individual selected by Dorothea Dix after Willie Lincoln died in the White House in February of 1862. Dorothea Dix went and considered all 250 nurses in the Washington, D.C. area, and she selected this woman, Rebecca, to go over to the Lincolns and to take care of the family. Their son, Tad, was still ill with typhoid. Brother Willie, as I mentioned, had passed away. Mary Todd Lincoln was beside herself with anxiety and grief, which you can understand. And so was President Lincoln, of course, too. What happened was the beginning of really a long friendship between Rebecca and the Lincoln family. But Rebecca was someone who, despite opportunities to perhaps join the Lincoln family permanently, she felt that her place was with her soldier boys, as she called them. So the reason I'm showing her tonight is to give you a little bit of that background and share this wonderful image from Chris Ford's collection. But I also want to tell you about an anecdote connected to her that is also connected to my interest. I'm always on the lookout for little bits of information where people, individuals from the Civil War period, mention photographs. And so I have a fairly poignant letter, or I should say this is an excerpt of a letter that she wrote on October 12th, 1861. And she's writing to someone called Dear Sister H. And towards the end of this, you'll see the reference to photographs. And I think this is important because it emphasizes how important photographs were to the soldiers. So let me read this excerpt. Dear Sister H, it is Saturday night, and I'm sitting in one of my pleasantest rooms watching over several of my boys. You can have no idea of their suffering, even if I should attempt to describe it. In the next room are two handsome young men, unconscious of suffering, who have been dying all night, and we are ignorant about their friends, as they came to us so delirious that they knew nothing. We always get their names, if possible, when the ambulance brings them in, that we may telegraph to their friends. When they are brought in, they are carried to the bathroom, stripped entirely and washed thoroughly. Then they are put into bed, and the clothing they wore is rolled up after the money, photographs, and the like are taken from their pockets. Their name marked on their bundle. Then, with the sword and knapsack, it is put in a shed on a shelf until called for. Many of our patients are dying of typhoid. Their tongues are black, and their breath is extremely offensive. Pretty powerful stuff. Eyewitness from Rebecca Pomeroy mentioning, in a small way, the photographs that they would remove from the pockets of the soldiers who came in to the hospital. They would save those photographs and the other personal objects, hopefully for the soldier when he recovered. If the soldier did not, those items would be normally given to the family if the soldier's identity was even known. Again, powerful stuff. I'm always on the lookout, I should mention, for references, anecdotes to photographs. If you have any, please send them my way. Thanks. So, what did I do this weekend? I went to visit John OBrien, and John is perhaps best known to my readers for this photograph right here. This is Jefferson Davis in a tintype that was previously unknown. Well, I should say it was known when it was taken by the photographer who took Jefferson Davis's photograph. It was in the Confederate White House until April 1865, when Union soldiers came in, Union officers occupied the house. And one of those officers, who happened to be related to the Union Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, his son was there, and his son stole or took these photographs from the house. This photograph of Jefferson Davis and then one of Verena stayed with the family until the 1980s, more than 100 years after the war. They eventually made it to John, and John held them for many years until publishing them in Military Images. So if you go back, I believe it was the spring 2016 issue, you can read the entire story and get the details. But what I want to talk about is something John shared with me this weekend. Take a look at these. At first glance, I don't know what you'll make of them. There's some fairly standard poses of Confederate generals, all slightly different than maybe some other versions you've seen. Some of them have been retouched. Some of them are maybe second or even third generation prints. You recognize Jefferson Davis down here. You've got Robert E. Lee, Jeb Stuart. You've got some other folks up here. And taken as a group, they're quite nice portraits of Confederate generals. What really makes them interesting for me is what's on the back. You might not recognize these back marks, but they're all British. And you're thinking, well, that's great. Why? These images gives you a sense of how folks in London, Manchester, other parts of England, how did they see the Confederate generals? How did they get a sense? What was their view like? Remember, this is a time when photography is still in its infant stages, and news magazines and newspapers, the technology to be able to reproduce photographs hadn't been invented yet. It wouldn't be invented until the 1870s and be perfected in the 1880s. So what we're looking at are copies of photos that were produced and probably sent across the Atlantic at some point and reproduced then in London and other parts of the country. So these likenesses here are probably the main view that Londoners had of the heroes of the Confederate Army and Jefferson Davis himself. This is how they saw the Confederates. This was their view of those individuals who were leading the Confederate armies. So I think this is kind of interesting when you compare it to images that Americans had to look at. So I don't want to give away too much of the detail here because the research is still in progress. John OBrien and I are going to work on a story for a future issue, probably the next issue, to talk a bit more about these British views of Confederate generals and give you a sense of why they're important. So, I want to take you now back to the Union side. All right. We have an unidentified officer. This is an albumin photo, probably about 8 by 10 measurements. This is a cropped version. I cropped it just for the printout, but there's a full mat around this. This is recently added to the collection of Andrew Garton. I know Andrew is here watching tonight. And I think it's an interesting photograph. I mentioned to you that we don't know the identity of the soldier, but the photographer is known from Bridgeport, Connecticut. So that gives us a clue to be able to track him down. Andrew, I'd recommend that you put this on Civil War Photo Sleuths and see what you can find out. I wanted to show it to all of you for two additional reasons other than photo sleuths. I wanted to point out two details that I'm not quite sure what they mean. Here's a close-up of his vest, and what you can see is a small, round, it's almost like a button. And when Andrew and I, I'll hold it up here for you can see a little bit better. When Andrew and I began trading texts about this, I wasn't quite sure. I thought maybe it was some tinting that the photographer did, but the edges around the circle, they're too well defined, they're too even, they're too consistent to be some tinting error. So I'm not quite sure what it is. It looks like it's some sort of button. Maybe it was a clasp that held a pocket watch chain. You can see a little bit of a shadowing going on over there. So maybe there's a watch chain that's not visible. So it's an interesting little mark, and I would love for anyone out there who has any thoughts about it to be able to share it. The reason I was thinking that it might have something to do with tinting is because of the ink that's been placed over it. You can see, you may be able to see the edges of his coat, the edges of his vest. The photographer or someone on the photographer's staff has come in with an ink wash to add a bit of contrast. In the 1900s to 20th century, that's known as photo retouching, and it was quite a big business up until the digital age, when the same work was done in Photoshop instead of with brushes and ink. So we can see clear evidence, the buttonholes, the edges of the vest. There's some pretty heavy work there with the ink wash. But what we also see is that the photographer appears to have covered over the brass buttons, both on his uniform coat and also on his vest. Now that's unusual, and you have to ask the question is, why would the photographer cover over the brass buttons? And I can think of one possible reason. Perhaps this man was a chaplain or became a chaplain, but that doesn't really add up, because the buttons a chaplain would wear were typically dark cloth covered, not blackened brass. So not quite sure what's going on here, but I can tell you it's quite an interesting, it's a really, really quite nice photo. Facebook Live isn't doing total justice to it, but I'll put it on the Facebook page after I'm done talking, and you can inspect it for yourself, and would be curious for any ideas you might have. Next image I want to share with you is right here. I have to say I've become fascinated, maybe in the last year or so, with memorial, what I'm calling memorial photographs. And these are images that were made after a soldier died, whether from disease or from a battle wound. And obviously these are images of the soldiers while they were alive. And they were made, these are basically copy prints made of albumin prints, made of tintypes, made from ambrotypes or cartes de visite. And they seem to be mostly made in the carte de visite format so that they could share these with grieving family members and friends and maybe comrades from the Army. So the gentleman that we see here is Private Admiral T. Kuhn. And yes, his name is Admiral, his first name. He served in the 137th New York Infantry. This is from the Chuck Joyce collection. And he's holding a child, and the child is named Edward Layton. Both of the subjects did not live long after this photograph was taken. Private Kuhn was mortally wounded, shot in the intestines on Culp's Hill on July 2nd at Gettysburg. and he died the following day at the 12th Corps Hospital. The child, Edward, he died actually before the private. He died in March of 1863. So I think this is kind of interesting to be able to get a sense of these images. But what becomes one of the challenges is dating them. We know for sure that this was made after July of 1863, when Private Kuhn succumbed to his mortal wound. But we don't exactly know when. We do know, however, that there's a back mark here, which gives us a pretty good clue. This says E. Murphy and Brother Photographers, 53 Court Street, Binghamton, New York. Now, one of the great resources that I've found that can really be helpful is called Langdon's List. It's a website. It's been around, I think, for a dozen years or so. And Langdon's List is fairly comprehensive, has uncounted photographs, at least I haven't counted them. It basically traces photographers and the years that they were in operation. And for example, and this is where this becomes really appropriate here, to get a sense of when this image was made, if you look up the photographer Murphy and Brother, you'll find a fairly lengthy entry. The photographer was actually Ezra Murphy. And Langdon's List records, and I'm going to hold this up so you can see it quickly. Here's the entire entry from Langdon's List. And what they've done here is they've documented all of the known back marks that they could find. And as you may know, those back marks change over time as the photographer changes addresses, takes on a partner, is just looking to kind of freshen up the design. So in the case of Ezra Murphy, there's numerous changes that start in the late 1860s and go all the way up to 1883. So this is a document of about 20 years of a photographer's back marks. And the very first one on the list is the one that is a perfect description of the back mark that you're looking at here. It says exactly what we see on the image: Murphy, E. and Brother, Photographers, 53 Court Street, Binghamton, New York. This one, this particular entry is dated from the late 1860s. The next entry on the list is E. Murphy and Brother, Photographist, Binghamton, New York. And there's a known example that's dated 1870. So we know, based on Langdon's List and the back mark that's been documented, that this particular image probably dates from 1867 to 1869. Could be possibly in early 1870 before the next documented back mark is shown. So I wanted to give you this example to give you a sense of another angle to help date your photographs, which is to go to Langdon's List if the photographer is listed, and you can take a look at the back marks there, and maybe that can help you with other clues on the photograph itself to be able to date the image. And that can be important, as you know, in a bunch of ways. In the particular case of Private Kuhn, I suppose you have to wonder, at what point in the late 1860s was it a wife who wanted to make copies for her surviving children? At least one brother survived. Were these made by the family? Was it made by comrades who served in the 137th New York? By that time, they would have formed a local chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic, and perhaps they wanted to remember their fallen comrades in some sort of a ceremony. There's a bunch of reasons to have these images made. We're only scratching the surface here, but the dating of the back marks can certainly help do that. So if you're looking for information about Langdon's List, I'll post the link on this Facebook page, and you can check it out. I want to leave you tonight with something a bit on the headier philosophical side. And I'm going to take you back to my day with John O'Brien on Saturday. John has been around for a while. He started collecting, if I understand correctly, probably in the early 1950s. He's been at this for a long, long time. And John is a historian, he's a journalist, he's a teacher, he's a collector of all kinds of fine art, photography. You name it, John seems to have touched on it. His true joy, though, is Jefferson Davis. That's where his main collecting interest is, and he has a soft spot for Robert E. Lee as well. So after we spent a couple hours looking at his collection, we were talking and laughing about the fact that we're probably just a bunch of crazy collectors and what makes us tick. And John said, well, you know, as Werner Munsterberger would say, we're all a bunch of crazy collectors. And I thought, I have to admit to you, who in the heck is Werner Munsterberger? I have no idea. So I asked John, I said, well, who is this guy? And he said, well, Munsterberger wrote this book about collecting, and it's got a lot of good information. You should read it. So as soon as I got home, I sat down at the computer and I looked up Werner Munsterberger, and here's the cover of his book that was published. This is, I think, a 1993 version of the book, but the original, I believe, was published in the 50s. And it's called An Unruly Passion. And like many books that are sort of the pop psychology of the 1950s, it goes back to Freud, and there's plenty of discussion about things that happened in our childhoods that make us into the collectors that we are today. And as you can imagine, some of it is good, some of it is not so good. But Munsterberger goes into some detail. Now, I haven't read the book, but I read some reviews of it and got a sense that he does a pretty good job tracing the history of collectors. And if you read on enough in some of the comments, you'll find more modern collectors take issue with Munsterberger because they blame him for picking up on Freudian themes and running wild with them. And some folks are saying, gosh, I wish we had someone in the modern day who would write about collectors and the collecting mentality. And guess what? There's a lot of those people out there too. So I went further down the rabbit hole and came up with, I think, is a pretty interesting read. I've got this book ordered and haven't received it yet. It's by Philip Bloom, and it's called To Have and Hold, An Intimate History of Collectors and Collecting. And apparently, Mr. Bloom goes back to I think the 1600s and details some of the earlier collectors, I guess earlier recorded collectors. I think collecting goes back to the humankind. So Blum's book apparently is quite an entertaining and fascinating history of collectors, and within that is buried some traits that I suspect all of us would find of interest. So when I get that book, I'm going to try to make some time to read it, and I'll let you know more if it rises to the level of me wanting to talk about it. So until then, I wish all of you well. I thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Very excited to have you. We've got some great folks tuning into the program, and I really appreciate your comments and your thoughts and your support for Military Images Magazine and for the collecting community. So those of you that are collectors, our subscribers, your issue should be coming in the next couple of weeks. If you're not a subscriber, please check out our website, militaryimagesmagazine.com, and you can learn more about what makes us all passionate collectors. So with that, have a great night. Bye now.